Module 10, the nitrogen cycle. In this module, you have already covered the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the oxygen cycle. Well, there's one more ecological cycle that's important to study, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a major component of proteins, so therefore it is important for life. That's why we need to understand what happens to nitrogen within organisms and what happens to it when they die. I already mentioned that oxygen makes up about 21% of the air we breathe. Well, nitrogen makes up about 78% of it. But interestingly, we cannot use the nitrogen in its gaseous form. Our bodies cannot take it in as we breathe. We just breathe it back out. But all organisms need to take in nitrogen for their physical processes. So how do they get it? They get it in molecules that make it more chemically available. Molecules that include nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. Well, the nitrogen in the air does provide a good resource for organisms, but to convert it to a more usable form, it has to be fixed into more chemically usable molecules. This is done through the process called nitrogen fixation. And one type of nitrogen fixation occurs as a result of lightning. Lightning can cause nitrogen gas to react with water vapor and fall to the ground in rain, resulting in nitrites and nitrates. But most nitrogen fixation occurs through nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which have an amazing ability to take nitrogen gas directly out of the air and chemically convert it to ammonia and then nitrites and nitrates. These bacteria are called nitrifying bacteria. Then, producers such as plants can use these molecules in their life processes. Of course, then, the producers can be eaten by primary consumers, who will get their nitrogen from the producer's tissue. Secondary consumers then can obtain their nitrogen by feeding on the primary consumers, and this will bring the nitrogen up the food chain. Now, does the nitrogen just remain bound up in these creatures? No, and that is a good thing, because if it did, the Earth would eventually run out of its nitrogen supply, because it would be bound up in all of the organisms on the planet. Some nitrogen is excreted by the producers and consumers as waste products. These wastes contain nitrogen in a chemically active form so that producers can use them again. A good example of this is when farmers use manure to fertilize their plants. Much of that waste product of the consumer is filled with usable nitrogen that the plants can utilize in order to grow. Now, the rest of the nitrogen remains in the bodies of the producers and consumers until they die. But that's not the end of the story. When an organism dies, the decomposers begin to break down the dead organic matter, releasing nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia back into the soil for producers to use again. Now, there's one final part of this diagram I have to add. We have the cycle of nitrogen gas moving from the fixers, then to the producers, next to the consumers. They can produce more nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia via their wastes. When they die, the decomposers can also release usable nitrogen too. But there are some bacteria that take the usable nitrogen chemicals and reconvert them back to nitrogen gas, adding to the concentrations of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. We call these denitrifying bacteria, and they remove the nitrogen back out of the food chain.